At this time of year, it can be hard to get trades done because more and more managers know what direction their team is going, and they might already have the players that they want, right? A lot of the contending pieces are on contenders, a lot of the rebuilding pieces are on rebuilders, and that can leave you with a limited number of trade partners. So while I'd love to tell you to buy Devontae Adams, there's a good chance he's on a team that needs that production. RJ Harvey is a great buy in theory, but the manager that's held him all year is probably not flipping him for a discount before he makes his first start. So the players I'm highlighting today as buys for contenders and rebuilders are ones that I think are maybe more undervalued by the average dynasty manager and maybe just more attainable due to situational factors or recent performances. My name is Paul. This is Pure Potential. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, leave a comment. Let's go. All right, if you're wondering where I've been the last 2 weeks because you're not in the Pure Potential Discord, link below, my wife just had a baby last Tuesday, our second. So I took a little hiatus, a little break from the content game, but I'm back now and should be good to go with more Dynasty content each and every week for the rest of the season. So again, hit the subscribe button, make sure you don't miss out on that. And let's get to our first trade target today, which is Luther Burden, 99th overall player on Fantasy Calc, wide receiver 34, might be my #1 trade target in Dynasty right now for contenders and rebuilders. I really do not care what position your team is in because I think Luther Burden's Dynasty value is about to explode. So if you can get in on him as a borderline top 100 asset outside the top 30 wide receivers, you should do it, regardless of your team's current position. He hasn't gotten off to a very fast start in the NFL, hasn't gotten on the field as much as I would have hoped. So a couple times I've called him a buy previously, maybe a little bit premature. He hasn't gotten in the box score much. He hasn't been able to contribute to your lineups, but it's becoming clear every week that DJ Moore and Olamide Zaccheaus just are not getting the job done. They're not efficient players. And every time Luther Burden is on the field, good things happen. This tweet from Jared Smola really highlights that Luther Burden is now averaging 2.7 yards per route run. That leads all Bears wide receivers, nearly a full yard ahead of Rome Odunze, and it ranks third among 113 wide receivers league-wide with 15 or more targets. That is on a small sample of just 77 routes, as he mentions here in the tweet. And obviously, some of that is coming from designed looks. When you play a part-time role, the per-route metrics can be a little bit deceiving. But the thing about Luther Burden is he just passes the eye test, too. He looks great whenever he's on the field. He's getting open. He makes plays with the ball in his hand, and he's been drawing some praise from Ben Johnson, who might be starting to trust his rookie pass catchers a little bit more, Colston Loveland, Luther Burden. This is what Ben Johnson said about Luther Burden after their Week 10 win over the Giants. You've slowly seen his rep count go up. He's the guy that's starting to get more targets. It's a trust level between the coaches and the player. It's a trust level between the quarterback and a receiver. It continues to ascend. And so he's been very productive when we've been able to get the ball in his hands. And there's a strong argument that we should get it to him more. So if and when we see Burden in a full-time role, next to Rome Odunze, I think the upside here is extremely high. I won't say it's the most likely outcome because it isn't, but he could overtake Odunze as the alpha wide receiver in this offense. He could lead this team in targets. Either way, though, there is room for both of these guys to coexist, and he has a very fantasy-friendly skill set as a serious yards after catch weapon. And one more tweet here from the Fantasy Points data account before we get to the actual trade suggestions, just because it's funny. Luther Burden has 90% of Olamide Zaccheaus' receiving yards on 40% as many routes and 38% as many targets. What are we even doing here? Couldn't agree more. They have to get him on the field. They absolutely have to. What am I trading for Luther Burden? As far as picks, I'd like to do it without moving a first. I think it's very likely his value does surpass a late first by the end of the season. But the idea of a buy is you're trying to get actual value, right? And where he's ranked, you just shouldn't have to move a first. So anything short of that, early second, a second and a third, 2 late seconds, I'm totally fine with that, but I just would rather keep a first round pick in my back pocket for the time being. As far as trading players, though, if you could pivot off of any of these wide receivers, Matthew Golden, Xavier Worthy, Cortland Sutton, Quentin Johnston, love to do that. And at running back, I know it might be hard to move some of these guys if you're relying on the points, but I do think from a value standpoint, it could just be such a huge win that I'd be willing to do it and then try to figure out other answers elsewhere. But Rico Dowdle, Travis Etienne, Jalen Warren, Kenneth Walker, if you can capitalize on someone who is really, really desperate for those running back points and you can move players that are more, short-term assets, or somebody in Walker who just isn't that useful right now, maybe is a little bit less likely to gain a lot of value over the course of the rest of the season, I would do that to get a chance at Luther Burden. Our next target, though, is a more straightforward contender buy, and that is Javonte Williams. I was too low on Javonte coming into the season. I just didn't think he was capable of getting back to his pre-injury form after he had played so poorly for multiple years. He was arguably the worst starting running back in the NFL last year in Denver, but he has absolutely proved me wrong here, because he hasn't just gotten the workload in Dallas. He's not just getting fed all these touches and doing nothing with them. He has legitimately looked good. He looks like he's gotten a lot of that juice back, a lot of that wiggle that made him such a good prospect coming into the league. And now he's become a very useful fantasy asset. He's just 25 and a half years old. He is averaging 17 and a half points per game. That's clearly useful for a contender. You can't have too many RB1 producers, but I do think there might be a buying opportunity here for a couple of reasons. He was on buy in week 10 after his worst fantasy performance of the year in week 9, which might not seem like a big deal, but just psychologically, I do think it makes him more available than if he was coming off of like a 20-point game recently. And then the other reason is just his perception relative to other backs that are actually quite similar on paper. If you look at this data from the Fantasy Points data suite, promo code PURE15, by the way, if you want to get 15% off your own copy of the data suite. You compare him here to other workhorse running backs, Josh Jacobs, James Cook, Kyron Williams, Saquon Barkley. They're all valued ahead of Javonte on sites like Fantasy Calc and probably in most of your leagues as well. But what they're providing right now week to week is actually quite similar. They're all workhorse running backs handling between 59 and 63% of their team's total rush attempts. And they're all functional, but not really highly involved in the passing game. You look at Javonte here, he sits in the middle of this group in terms of points per game at 17 and a half, but he's actually second in expected points per game at 16.8. So he's getting the usage. He's handling the second highest percent of his team's total rushes at 61%. To be fair, James Cook and Saquon are being a little bit depressed by Hurts and Allen's rush attempts, but still, he's getting the bulk of the carries, and he's actually second in targets among this group as well. Not because his target share is super high, but just because the Cowboys throw so many passes. So volume-wise and production-wise, he's right there with these players. The difference from a dynasty standpoint is really brand equity and contract status. The other four guys here have a reputation as high-end fantasy running backs. Managers trust them more as long-term contributors, and they all have lucrative contract extensions, which makes you feel safer about their roles, whereas Javonte is currently playing on a very cheap one-year deal. But I would argue that Javonte has pretty easily played himself into a solid payday, maybe with the Cowboys, maybe with someone else because they haven't been willing to pay up for running backs before. But at the very least, it is a risk I'm willing to take on Javonte, given his age, given where he's currently valued, and what he can contribute to your dynasty team down the stretch. So just looking at the running back position and players that are seemingly valued in the same range as Javonte, I would be willing to pivot from Derrick Henry or Chase Brown. These guys are all kind of immediate point scoring bets. So if somebody's higher on those other two, I'd rather have Javonte. And then I'll also throw Cam Scadaboo into the mix. It's possible his value on sites like Fantasy Calc is still falling and hasn't fully adjusted to his injury. But there are probably teams that have Javonte that are not in the playoff mix, and maybe they liked what they saw from Scadaboo as a rookie. Maybe they'd rather roll the dice on him recovering and returning to form as a slightly younger player than Javonte getting that long-term deal. So I think those are, realistic enough pivot options. I'd also be willing to tier up from Rico Dowdle, who might score similarly or even more points than Javonte rest of season. But with Javonte, you're getting 2 years younger, and I think a player that's just more likely to secure a long-term deal and be more useful in the future. And then also Travis Etienne, Kenneth Walker, DeAndre Swift. See if you have a piece on your bench, maybe some picks, late picks, see if you can make a swap. And then finally, I'd explore tearing down from the guys I talked about earlier, Josh Jacobs, Kyron Williams, Saquon Barkley, James Cook. Running back is such a year-to-year position. If you can pick up something significant to move down from one of those guys to Javonte Williams. And in the case of Kyron, I wouldn't even need something significant. I literally have them back-to-back in my rankings. But just see what's out there, see what you can get. Like I said, they have more brand equity, so you might be surprised at the return you can get. Moving over to the quarterback position now, I think Daniel Jones makes a lot of sense as a buy for contending teams. The resurgence of Danny Dimes, or Indiana Jones as he's now called, has been truly something to behold this year. It's not necessarily unprecedented given what we've seen from Baker Mayfield and Sam Darnold in recent seasons, but it's still somewhat shocking. You know, it seemed like it was so over for Daniel Jones, and now he's 4th in the league in passing yards per game. He is 9th in fantasy points per game, and his team is tied for the best record in the NFL. But over the past 2 weeks, against formidable pass rushes in Atlanta and Pittsburgh, he has 4 interceptions and relatively unimpressive finishes of QB 17 and QB 16. So I think there might be opportunity here, similar to Javonte, where you have a guy with a tarnished brand who's coming off of a couple rougher performances. So maybe you can find someone that really needs a quarterback this week, or is just getting cold feet on Daniel Jones in general. I will say he feels like a player that a non-playoff team would be pretty open to moving, but he's going to get a contract. He is going to get a big contract with the Colts. This team has just been far too successful. He has played very, very well, you know, in totality when you look across the season. I don't think we're seeing the beginning of some kind of massive collapse. I think there's just going to be some bumps and bruises along the way. But most importantly for contenders, he has the 3rd best fantasy playoff schedule, according to Scott Barrett's The Everything Report on fantasypoints.com. Definitely recommend checking that out. He has games against the Seahawks, 49ers, and Jaguars. The Seahawks have been a pretty average matchup as far as fantasy quarterbacks, but the other two are easily top 10 in fantasy points allowed. Those could be high scoring games against the Niners and Jaguars in the fantasy playoffs. So I think you're getting in on a quarterback that will have some security long term, certainly beyond this season, and could be one of the better options in the weeks that really matter. If you could tear down from Dak Prescott, Baker Mayfield, Jared Goff, Jordan Love, on the premise that those guys are just significantly safer in Dynasty, I'd look to do that. If you could tier up from Michael Penix, Matthew Stafford, Kyler Murray, I think that's worth doing. You know, see what you would have to add, but I'm pretty out on Michael Penix as a long-term investment. Matthew Stafford, obviously lighting up the box score right now. I can understand wanting to keep him, but you're just getting so much younger at the position. You're gaining back a lot of potential future value. And then Kyler, I'm actually going to get to him a little bit later in this video, but on a team where you need points now, you know, he's on IR. It might be worth seeing if you could like attach a 2nd round pick to him and turn him into Daniel Jones. And then finally, I do think it's okay to send a late projected 2026 first. You know, if you're a pretty locked in playoff team, I'd rather do it without a first, but I think it's totally defensible if you're really in need of that quarterback position. And again, he's one of the better targets right now at cost. Now, I've got one more player on the contending side before we do a couple of rebuilding targets, and that's Ricky Pearsall, who is reportedly healthy now, at least according to Kyle Shanahan, who has definitely never lied about the status of his players. Ricky Pearsall is 25 years old. He had 2 100-yard games in the first 4 weeks of the season before he suffered a PCL injury. It's the same injury that Brock Bowers had, and Brock Bowers came back after a similar amount of time out, put up a 40-point fantasy week. So I don't think it's crazy that Pearsall could be healthy now to make sense in terms of the timeline, and he's returning to a pretty great situation. Mac Jones and Brock Purdy are actually both top 4 in passing yards per game. I know Purdy only played 2 games, but this team is just slinging the football every week because the defense sucks and they can't run the ball. Christian McCaffrey is incredible as a pass catcher out of the backfield. He has not been incredible as a rusher. So the passing volume is cranked all the way up. This team is in shootouts almost every week. And it is admittedly a crowded receiving room right now with George Kittle, Jawan Jennings, and then, of course, Christian McCaffrey getting a ton of targets. But I am still happy to buy in on Pearsall at 85th overall, wide receiver 30 on Fantasy Calc, especially because he has the 2nd best playoff schedule for wide receivers. He plays the Titans, the Colts, and the Bears in those playoff weeks. The Titans game, probably not going to be a shootout, but could absolutely be a big offensive day for the 49ers. And then the Colts and the Bears, those both strike me as high scoring affairs, lots of passing volume to go around. I think he's as good a bet as anyone to contribute, some big spike weeks in the fantasy playoffs, assuming he's healthy. So if you can trade any pick short of a first is totally fine with me. I think a lot of managers are pretty impatient with Ricky Pearsall, maybe a little skeptical of what he's going to provide when he comes back. If you can pivot from Jameson Williams off of his big week, I'd rather have Pearsall. Maybe that's misguided. I'm just a little bit gun shy with Jameson Williams. It's just so up and down. Maybe the Dan Campbell takeover is real, and what we saw last week is more of what we'll see in the future. But I'm willing to take the shot on Pearsall over him, and then DK Metcalf and Xavier Worthy. I just think Pearsall is more likely to contribute down the stretch some legitimate, useful production, and I think he's going to carry more value into the offseason. And at running back and tight end, based on where he's sitting on Fantasy Calc, if you can flip Jake Ferguson or Dalton Kincaid, even in tight end premium, I would do that. Jalen Warren, Kenneth Walker at running back. Teams often are very desperate for running back at this time of year. Worth looking into. Okay, now let's flip over to the rebuilding side with Travis Hunter. I know the Travis Hunter experience has not been a fun one. He started slow out of the gate, really made us wait to see much of anything out of him. But he finally got his playing time ramped up. It looked like the start of a true breakout against the Rams back in, week 7? Then he gets hurt in practice during the bye week. He goes on IR, and we just recently learned his season is over. LCL surgery, I believe. It's kind of similar to what Rashee Rice suffered last year, but it's not as severe because there wasn't any other accompanying injuries that I'm aware of. So it sucks for Travis Hunter, especially if you drafted him in the top 2 or 3 in rookie drafts, which I certainly did a handful of times. But if you don't already have Travis Hunter, this is the perfect opportunity to buy. And let me just apologize in advance because I know I'm going to say this so many times in the offseason. I'm going to keep telling you over and over again, buy Travis Hunter. But I believe in what we saw in week 7. I think that was the start of a true breakout. The playing time was getting there. The comments from the coaches were there. I think he was learning the playbook, and I think he was finally breaking out in a real way. And I'm also not here to label a guy as injury prone for suffering a random injury in practice. I know there are plenty of people out there saying, you can't play both ways. This is why he got hurt, because he's trying to do too much. He had nearly the exact same number of total snaps as Tet McMillan going into his bye week. So yeah, he was playing some on both sides of the ball. He was not playing some ridiculous amount of snaps in total. And it was pretty clear that offense was winning the battle between the two. So if he's going to be limited to one side of the ball, it's probably going to be offense, especially with how things have gone for Brian Thomas. The team doesn't even have, a reliable number 1 wide receiver if it's not Hunter. So I think he comes back next year totally 100% healthy. And I think he has a very good chance to just be the top target on the team. But because we only got a glimpse of the possibilities with Hunter, I do think he's pretty attainable in deals right now. Certainly his fantasy calc value of 65th overall, wide receiver 24, that's way behind where I have him ranked. So I want to attack that aggressively wherever I can. I'd buy him on any team really, but I understand it's a pretty sizable investment to make even at that price when you're trying to, get points in your lineup. So that's why I say he's the perfect rebuilding target. If you could pivot off of Devonta Smith, Zay Flowers, T. Higgins, or Jalen Waddle, all those guys are ranked ahead of Hunter on Fantasy Calc right now. That's an easy call for me if you're out of the playoff mix and you don't need the points. I'd also look to tier down from Marvin Harrison, George Pickens, Lad McConkey, Rome Odunze. I'd move the first 2 guys straight up. Personally, I'd rather have Travis Hunter week 1, 2026 than Pickens or Marvin Harrison. Sue me. With Lad and Rome, I would actually want a plus on top, but the market dictates, you should be able to demand a pretty nice plus on top of those guys. So if you can add some extra picks to your arsenal and get Hunter, I think that's awesome. And then as far as picks, I'm not typically going to advocate trading picks away on a rebuild, but if you've already acquired, a nice little stockpile for yourself and you have a playoff teams first, I would absolutely send that for Travis Hunter. If somebody just wants to get off the roller coaster, I think that's a very palatable price to invest in. And I have one more player for you. One more trade target for rebuilders. That is Kyler Murray, who feels like one of the most toxic assets in Dynasty right now. And it's easy to understand why, right? He played poorly, he got hurt, and now Jacoby Brissett is lighting up the box score while he's on IR. The team has been super weird about his injury, and they definitely don't seem committed to Kyler as their long-term starter. But here's the thing, guys. Here's the thing. Kyler Murray is going to be a starting quarterback in 2026. Will it be for the Arizona Cardinals? I don't know. My lean would be probably not. But look around the NFL. There is a perpetual shortage of quarterback talent. Fields, Rattler, Shuck, Bryce, Penix, Geno, Tua. Kyler Murray is very comfortably one of the top 32 quarterbacks in the league. I think in the right situation, he could be a top 20 quarterback in the league. And after what we've seen with Baker and Darnold and Daniel Jones, why wouldn't a team take a shot on the former #1 overall pick? I think a change of scenery would do him a lot of good. And from what I understand, his contract is fairly tradable. And I'm not saying he's like secretly a superstar quarterback or that it's going to go exactly like it did with Baker, Darnold, these other guys. But where he's valued right now, you don't need it to work out that way. He's being valued. He's the quarterback 25. He's outside the top 80 players overall. I mean, he's sitting next to guys that are also, shaky long-term options, right? Rico Dowdle, Travis Etienne, like these are not guaranteed long-term plays either. I have more confidence in Kyler Murray putting up actual usable fantasy production next year than I do those players. So I think he makes a ton of sense as a buy low for rebuilding teams. There are contenders out there that lost Kyler and are piecing things together right now with guys like Mac Jones or Joe Flacco, who will eventually be back on the bench. So couple options for you. If you could tear down from Dak, Darnold, Jones, Lawrence, you don't need those guys if you are not trying to score points right now. And the gap between them and Kyler is right now, it's inflated because of the difference in their current projections, not because of the difference in their 2026 projections. So see what you can get on top. You might be able to really squeeze some value out of somebody who's trying to move Kyler for a usable immediate solution at quarterback. I'd also pivot directly from Michael Penix or Matthew Stafford. Again, I'm pretty out on Penix. I think he's far less likely to stick as a long-term quarterback than Kyler. And Stafford is awesome right now, but we hear the retirement rumors every single year. He's not getting any younger. I'd rather just reset that clock on a rebuilding team. And then as far as picks, like genuinely the way that some managers treat Kyler Murray, you might be able to get him for like a second and a third. That's not necessarily going to work for the contending teams that I described that are mainly looking for a replacement quarterback, but somebody that's just sick of Kyler Murray, that might be enough, honestly. That might be enough to sway them. So I know it's gross. I know it's not the most fun trade target. I just think it's kind of an eat your vegetables situation where I think he's just very likely to be ranked higher than this when week 1 comes around next year. Anyway, that's going to do it for today, guys. As always, thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you for supporting the channel. If you enjoy my Dynasty content and you want to see more in the future, please subscribe to the channel. Really goes a long way. And if you want even more Dynasty content from me, you can check out the membership options by hitting the plus on the subscribe button or the link in the description. That will get you access to weekly live streams here on YouTube, private channels in the Pure Potential Discord where you can ask me Dynasty questions whenever you want, and of course, my top 250 Dynasty rankings updated every single week during the season. I will be back soon with another Dynasty video, and I hope I see you then.